Hello, my name is Bryan Nerren, and this is the second installment on the Chronicles of Nepal. I'd like to talk to you and give you kind of an update of who the Asian Children's Education Fellowship is, where we came from, how we got started, and how this project in Nepal began for us. It was in the spring of 2001, around April, that I met a man by the name of Glenn Shepard. And Glenn Shepard began to explain to me and talk to me one evening about Nepal and the projects and the things he was doing there. And then he had this very unique approach. He said, Bryan, he said, the Holy Spirit is speaking to me and telling me that you should go with us to Nepal. I just met Glenn the day before, did not know him, he did not know me. He was preaching the last weekend of a 9-month community revival that was being held at First Baptist called Revival of a Lifetime. And that night when I met Glenn, I was there in the congregation close to him, and just before he spoke, the pastor said, like for some of you guys to lay hands on Glenn Shepard before he comes to speak. And so I was close and I went and I was there. And at the end of my time of praying for Glenn Shepard, I laid my hands on his shoulder. And Glenn reached out without looking at me and just took me by the hand when I pulled my hand away from him at the end of the time of prayer. No words were exchanged. He just touched my hand, grabbed it, held it for a few seconds, and went on to minister that night, a very effective and great message for that last revival. The next day he spent most of the day teaching a group that came together about prayer and intercessory and how prayer affects the church and the world and the global impact. Glenn Shepard is the director, president of the International Prayer Ministries movement, and been very effectively used in those areas. After that teaching that Saturday, I had the opportunity to take Glenn out to dinner. So we went out to a local restaurant here in Shelbyville, and we began sharing stories and pleasantries and spent 2 hours of just great quality time getting to know each other and learning about each other's families. And at the end of that time together is when he made that statement. Now here's kind of how he said it. My background has been predominantly Pentecostal all of my Christian life. Glenn was born and raised in Southern Baptist churches all of his life, and here's what he said. He said, Ryan, he said, I feel in the Spirit that the Holy Spirit is leading me to take you to Nepal this year. And he said, this may be a little strange for you. He said, but you're Pentecostal, you're used to strange stuff and Spirit-speaking stuff, so you'll be able to handle it. And I began explaining to Glenn and talking to Glenn about how much I would love to go, and I was excited about going, but it was an impossibility for my life at that time to be able to go away. I just returned from a 2-week trip with my dad to Israel. We had used up most of our funds. We were planning a summer trip for our son to go to South America to work with missionaries there, and the income of our family just wouldn't allow for it. And Glenn said, oh, don't worry about the money. Money's not a problem at all. God will work out the money. I expecting Glenn to be one of those rich Southern Baptist preachers to pay my way and something miraculous like that would happen. And my faith leaped, and I was excited about it. Little did I know I was wrong, and that wasn't how this thing was going to work out. Glenn just felt something, invited me, and I took the challenge and the excitement with it and denied it. And so I told him, I said, I can't go. He said, what is it? What's the reason? I said, well, it's the money. If I had the money and the Lord could bless me with the money, then I would go. And Glenn says, well, I know what I feel in the Spirit. We went back to his motel, and he talked some more, and he gave me the paperwork to fill out if the money came to be able to make the trip that fall to Nepal with him of 2001. And I talked to Glenn for a little bit longer about Nepal, and he began giving me the reasons not to go. He said, you need to be sure you know this is God and that you want to go. It's a dangerous place. They're in a civil war. It's a very poor nation. It's a very backward nation. There's all kinds of bugs and reptiles and insects there that can bite you and make you very sick or even kill you. It's not a safe place to be right now, but I know what the Spirit's saying. And so we talked through that process when we got ready. I left Glenn at his motel that night, and I began driving back to my house. And somewhere between there and the house, what I believe to be the Lord's voice spoke to me audibly out loud and told me not to miss what He was doing in my life. It brought me under an extreme state of humility, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what the emotional experience, except that I began to cry and I began to be very overtaken by the fact that God even knew where I was at, much less was willing to speak to me out loud. And it got my attention, to say the least. As I returned home that evening, just a short few miles from the motel, when I came into the house, my wife and my mother were there. Mom was in visiting for the weekend. And my wife looked at me and she said, "What's wrong with you? What's going on?" Because I was still crying uncontrollably, even though I was trying to put on the straight face. And I told her, I said, "There's nothing. It's not a big deal. I'm okay." And she said, "No, wait a minute. Talk to me. The last time you came home crying like that, we had to move to Cleveland, Ohio and live for 5 years. And I want to know what's happening, what's going on." And I said, "Well, the Lord just spoke to me in an audible voice and told me to go to Nepal." She said, "Where?" I said, "To Nepal." And so we began finding road atlases or world atlases, and we looked at those atlases to locate Nepal in the world, to the north of India and south of Tibet, China. And of course, Mount Everest is the most famous place there in Nepal. And we looked at that place, and I'll never forget what my wife said, because she looked at that. She said, "That's on the other side of the earth, ain't it?" And I said, "It is." My mother says, "It ain't safe. You don't need to go. You ain't got any business there." And Ron said, "It don't matter. Just go." Because she knew that it was impossible for me to go. There was no financial way for it to happen. There was no life left over in my life to fit in another project and another ministry thing. And I don't ever have the ability to say no. And she realized all of those things in my life. She said, "Just go. It's not a problem. Do what the Lord told you." And so I left the room and I went and got on the internet. And I began to look for Nepal and missionaries and connections, and could not find any information of any group that was actively working in Nepal as a missionary other than Glenn Shepherd's group, International Prayer Ministries. And so I went and laid down on the couch and I fell into sleep, a nap of sorts. And while I was having that nap, I had this dream. And in this dream, I was to go to a lady in our church and tell this lady about this idea and this thought and what Nepal was about. And then I woke up and I remember telling the Lord, "All right, Lord, I know I'm supposed to go. I know you want me there, and I'll get there. But I'm not begging for this money. And I'm surely not going to church people, being a pastor, asking a saint in the church for what would need to be about $4,000 for me to make this trip to Nepal." And I told him, I said, "I'm not telling her, and I'm not asking her for the money, but I will go." And so spent a little more time with my mom and my wife before bedtime, and we talked about Nepal and the different things. That night in my sleep, over and over and over again, I had that same dream to tell this lady in our church about what was going on with Nepal and what was happening. The next morning was Sunday morning. I got up and went off to church like I always do early to study and to pray and to be alone. And when I was there in the room where I pray at the church, I began feeling the presence of God in the room in a very powerful way. And everything was about Nepal, and my mind was filled with Nepal and missions and life and how it affected the kids and the church and all of the parts and pieces of making a big step to go to a place like Nepal. And as the presence of the Lord began growing in the room, there was first a conviction that said, "You need to call this lady and tell her to come into church and tell her." But I was so against that I'd left my phone at home so I would not even be tempted to call them. And the presence of the Lord began to grow, and I prayed more. And I got to the point with God's presence in that room to where that I could not recognize my heart beating. I could not get a breath of air into my lungs that was working. And I remember the thought, "Lord, if you'll just back away, I'll go home and I'll call." And the crying, which is kind of uncharacteristic for me back then, but not now, was unusual for me, because I just cried and I cried and I could do things, but I couldn't quit crying. And so I went back to the house crying, and my wife said, "What's going on?" I said, "Nothing." I grabbed my phone and I called this lady and her husband. I said, "Can y'all come in early for church? And I need to talk to you." And I continued to cry and uncontrollably couldn't stop the waterworks. Even though I could talk, I couldn't stop the water from coming from my eyes. They came into church early that morning, and it was Brother and Sister Bolin. And I remember when they came in the room, the fear on his face when he saw me. He was called in early. I'm the pastor. And he had that look in his face like something horribly wrong has happened in the church. And so when I saw the fear in his face, I tried to joke a little bit or make it light. And they came in and sat down, and I couldn't quit crying. And Sister Bolin, after a while of hearing me talk and ramble and try to make things okay for them, she said, "Well, just stop that and tell us why we're here." So I began telling them the story that I just told you about Glenn and Nepal and the Lord speaking to me about going to Nepal. And she began to cry. And she stopped me before I finished all of the story. And she said, "This week, while I was praying, the Lord impressed on me that whatever happened this week in revival at First Baptist, I was supposed to help you take care of it and help you work it out. So Brother and Sister Bolden took the responsibility that morning of the finances of the trip. And they said, we'll pay it, raise the money, we'll take care of it, don't you worry about it. And they did exactly that. And we had, of course, church service that morning. My wife came and people came. And even though I could talk to them, I couldn't quit crying. It was kind of a strange thing and a really awesome thing, because God is doing something incredibly unusual and something completely different than anything that I am a Pentecostal is supposed to be aware of. And His presence and His love and His power was unbelievable. The grace of God that fills your mind and your soul in a time like this is hard to explain, because you just don't go there normally. You don't get a chance to visit His presence like that. We had our church service started that morning. I was unable to preach, and so they worshiped and they talked, and and it was fun watching the church from now, looking back to the church, because there was all kinds of fear and emotions and wonders. Oh, what's going on with the pastor? Why is this happening? And they had those questions about, oh, there may be something wrong with his marriage, or there could be something wrong with something, this and that and the other, and everybody had their ideas and thoughts. I simply couldn't talk enough to explain it or talk about it. I got a few words out. I told them what we were trying to do in the Bolden's connection, and we dismissed and went home. At that time, we had 2 services on Sunday, and I remember I came back that night and we talked about Nepal and the call God had called the church to, not just me, but the International House of Prayer was going to be an active part of His project in Nepal, and it was in a city or global atmosphere of other churches and other people that it seemed good, and lots of ideas and dreams and visions of things that now has happened, but at that point it was just a dream, a fantasy. Wasn't sure how it would happen. I'll never forget what happened at the end of service that night. Rhonda and I were driving home from church, and she said, "Is that all there is to it?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You're really going to Nepal." And I said, "Well, yeah, you told me last night. Just go. It didn't make any difference." She said, "But that was impossible last night. Now you've got the money and the plan and the purpose, and you're just going, aren't you? You're on your way to Nepal no matter what." I said, "Yeah, no matter what. I am on my way to Nepal because God called me. God asked me to." And I remembered a time when I was much younger that God had asked me to do a project not large like Nepal, but a project that I could have done, and a project that I was being supported to do, and other people were around me to do, and I got afraid of my limitations. And I backed away from God, and for 20 years as a Christian, God never moved on me and challenged me or opened an opportunity for me up for me to do the things that I dreamed of doing that He gave me, because I was afraid and I said no then. I wanted to be sure this time I didn't miss the will of God, the plan of God, and the purpose of God. So I made the commitment. And we were on our way, and the money was in, and the research started, and the excitement started, and we talked about it, and we prayed about it, and the church really got emotionally involved and got involved in all the prayer, and we were praying, and we were studying, and a prayer group here in town that I've been praying with for a couple of years became very involved, and there was all kinds of people excited, and all kinds of people praying about going to Nepal and doing the work in Nepal, and knowing it was a Hindu nation, and knowing it was a place that was dark and full of wickedness and witchcraft. And boy, we were on the road. We were excited, and it was going. And wouldn't you know, at the end of 2001, September the 11th, America would be attacked by terrorists, and the world would be turned upside down. Before our time to go to Nepal, which was scheduled for November that year, we would enter into a war along the same time frame in Afghanistan, and it became irrational, not wise to travel to go to Nepal. Man, I was defeated. And I'll never forget calling Glenn Shepherd and saying, "Glenn, why did God speak to me, and why did the money come so quick, and how did we get a plan to go to Nepal, and 9/11 happened, and it not happen? God knew about it. God's okay with it." And Glenn was the voice of wisdom and understanding, and he kept telling us, "Bryan, we ain't going. We ain't going. We'll go next year, but we ain't going now." And I was very frustrated. I was very confused in trying to hear God's voice and keep up with God's voice, and follow, all of these emotions and excitement and waves and waves. And we didn't go to Nepal that fall. We didn't get to go until the following fall of 2002, which was my first trip to Nepal. But lessons that'll follow in these chronicles as we go forward in this story will show you things that you can learn from God. When God gets you excited, and then it's just hard uphill work to stay faithful, to keep hope alive, and live a dream of a lifetime. it is a dream worth having, and it is a dream worth working on. So thank you for letting me introduce this beginning, the first part of how the trip to Nepal began. Thank you.